The dusty square of Dry Creek fell silent the moment they dragged her out. A girl, no, hardly older than 20, staggered into the open air, her dress torn, stained dark where her body had not yet healed from the cruel storm of childbirth. The baby she had delivered hours ago was nowhere in sight, ripped from her arms before she could even count its tiny fingers. She was pale, trembling, her bare feet scraping against the rough wood of the auction block as jeers rose from the crowd. "Fresh stock," barked the trader, his voice booming with the hollow pride of a man who sold flesh for profit. "Strong enough to work, young enough to bear more children, and still alive after the bleeding. That's hardy breeding, gentlemen. Who'll start me at $10? Laughter rolled across the square. Hats tilted back, boots scraped against the dirt, and whiskey-glazed eyes glimmered with cruel hunger. Some men spoke of her hips, others of her price, but none spoke of her humanity. She swayed under their gaze, the world swimming, pain ripping through her belly, blood still seeping where her child had been torn from her. Her lips moved in silent prayer, not for herself, but for the infant she had not seen since the moment its cry was stolen from her ears. From the edge of the crowd, one man stood apart, a giant of a rancher, broad as the oaks in the river valley, his coat weathered, his hat shadowing eyes that had seen too much. Elias Kane, a man who rarely came to town, had sworn off markets like these long ago. Yet something in the way she clung to her last ounce of strength held him there, rooted like a mountain. Her courage, even in ruin, struck deeper than any brand or bargain could. 10, shouted a ranch hand, smirking as though it were a game. 12, called another, already laughing at the thought of breaking her spirit. The numbers climbed, but the girl's spirit did not falter. She raised her head once, her eyes meeting the crowd, not pleading, not begging, but burning with the last defiance she could muster. That fire, flickering though it was, caught Elias in the chest. 50, his voice thundered, cutting through the drunken noise like a rifle shot. The square froze. Men turned. The auctioneer blinked, startled. No one doubled such a price, not for a girl broken from childbirth, not for one they assumed would not survive the week. 50, going once, the trader's voice cracked. He glanced around, but the crowd had gone silent. None dared challenge a sum that high. Twice, sold, to Mr. Kane. His gavel cracked against the wood. The men muttered, some cursing, some laughing in disbelief. They all knew Kane, a loner with a ranch big enough to fill horizons. If he wanted the girl, none would cross him. Elias moved forward, his boots heavy against the boards. When he reached her, he did not grip her wrist like property or sling her over his shoulder like cattle. Instead, he unfastened his coat and wrapped it gently around her trembling shoulders. The girl flinched, expecting cruelty, but his touch was steady, almost careful. "You'll not stand here another minute," he murmured low, only for her ears. The trader shoved a crude bill of sale into his hand, but Elias never looked at it. Paper meant nothing. What mattered was the girl's weight, frail and shaking, as he lifted her easily into his arms. She gasped, not from fear, but from the shock of being carried without violence. For the first time in what felt like forever, she closed her eyes, resting her head against a chest that beat with something steady, something unyielding. As Elias turned toward his waiting horse and wagon, the crowd parted. Men who had jeered fell silent, watching the giant cowboy stride through them with his burden held close. They whispered, that he was a fool, that she'd die before sunrise, that he had wasted money. But Elias Kane did not hear them. All he heard was the faint, broken sound of her breathing, and all he knew was this: she was no slave, no purchase. She was a soul worth saving. The trail back to Elias Kane's ranch stretched long and lonely, a ribbon of dust and silence between the widow-making mountains and the far-off riverbeds. In the back of his wagon, wrapped in his heavy coat, the girl drifted in and out of consciousness. Every jolt sent a fresh wave of pain through her body, but the smell of leather, wood smoke, and horsehide was strangely comforting, not the stench of sweat and liquor that had haunted her at the auction block. When the wagon finally slowed, her eyes fluttered open to see a sprawling ranch house rising against the evening sky, its weathered timbers standing proud against the plains. Elias carried her inside without a word, his boots thudding softly against the floorboards. He laid her gently on a bed she could never have imagined was meant for her. Clean sheets, a quilt hand-stitched with fading colors, a window that opened to the endless prairie. She tried to push herself up, fear spiking that this was some new kind of trick, but his hand was firm on her shoulder. "Rest. No man will touch you here," he said, his voice gravel rough but steady. That first night, she could barely hold down water. The fever took her, twisting her dreams into shadows of crying infants and mocking faces. Elias sat through it, a massive figure hunched beside the bed, his weathered hands carefully wiping her brow with a damp cloth. He didn't flinch at the blood, didn't turn away at the sound of her sobbing in her sleep. He only stayed, a silent sentinel against the ghosts that plagued her. Days bled into nights, and slowly, the worst of the bleeding eased. She could walk a few steps, then more. Elias never pressed her for thanks, never asked her name until she was ready. One morning, when she finally whispered, "Clara," his nod was simple, as though he had been waiting all along. "Clara," he repeated softly, as if memorizing it, sealing it against the walls of silence that had surrounded her. Life on the ranch began to shape around her recovery. She learned the rhythm of the place, the creak of the windmill, the smell of hay when the barn doors swung open, the lowing of cattle as Elias moved among them. He worked like a man twice his size, his frame bending fences back into place, his hands steadying wild colts. And yet, when he returned inside, his footsteps always softened near her, as though he feared startling a bird too fragile to fly. Clara found herself staring at him when she thought he didn't notice. The world whispered that men like him were born for violence, yet she saw a gentleness in the way he set a chipped cup on the table, or the way he stood outside her window at night, ensuring she slept undisturbed. Once, when a storm lashed the ranch, she caught him working in the downpour, securing the shutters so the wind wouldn't rattle her room. Her heart clenched at the thought, this giant who owed her nothing guarded her as though her safety mattered more than his own. But healing wasn't simple. At night, Clara would wake in terror, clutching at her belly, her voice breaking for the child she had been forced to leave behind. She wept into her hands, ashamed of her weakness. One night Elias heard and stood in the doorway, silent for a long while before finally speaking. "The world took too much from you. Let me give back what I can. Even if it's just a roof." His voice was low, filled with an ache she couldn't name. He didn't ask her to forget, only to endure. In town, whispers grew louder. Men muttered that Cain had gone soft, that he'd paid $50 for a woman already broken. Some sneered that he kept her for himself, others claimed she was a curse on his house. Elias heard them but didn't answer. Clara, however, did. The first time she walked into the mercantile beside him, weak but standing tall, the room fell silent. She didn't hide behind him, she lifted her chin, though her hands trembled. And in that moment, the townsfolk saw something they hadn't expected, not a girl bought and broken, but a woman alive, unbent by their cruelty. That night, over a simple supper of beans and bread, Clara looked at Elias and managed her first true smile since the day she had been dragged from her child. It was faint, fragile, but it lit something in the air between them. Elias paused mid-bite, his eyes softening in a way that made her breath catch. That smile told him more than words ever could, that though her body had been sold, her spirit was finding its way back. The ranch no longer felt empty. The silence that had once been Elias's burden began to change, colored by her presence. Clara's voice humming softly while she folded laundry, the clatter of dishes as she tried her hand in the kitchen, even her quiet laughter when he fumbled awkwardly with small talk. And though nothing had been spoken yet, something undeniable was growing, not possession, not pity, but the beginning of a bond carved out of pain and patience. The peace of the ranch could not last. Rumors travel faster than storms on the prairie, and Clara's presence stirred envy, lust, and old grudges. One night, as the sun bled into the horizon, 3 riders appeared at the edge of Elias Cain's land. They were men from the auction, the very ones who had laughed and jeered when she was dragged onto the block. Whiskey glimmered in their eyes, and iron hung heavy at their hips. They claimed Clara was theirs by right, that Cain had no business keeping her when she should have been broken and sold again. Elias met them at the gate, his frame towering, his voice calm but edged like steel. "She isn't yours. She never was. You'll ride off, or you'll ride into the ground." The men sneered, spitting into the dirt. One lifted his hand as if to test the weight of his revolver, but the way Elias's shadow loomed over them made even the bravest hesitate. Clara, watching from the porch, clutched the railing so tightly her knuckles whitened. Fear rose in her chest, but so did something else, fury. She had been sold once, torn from her child, branded in their eyes as less than human. She would not let them take her again. That night, Elias barred the doors and sat by the fire, rifle laid across his lap. Clara joined him, wrapping herself in the quilt, her voice quiet but firm. You don't have to fight for me. He turned, his eyes dark with something deeper than rage. Clara, you don't understand. I ain't fightin' for you. I'm fightin' because no man alive has the right to strip you of your soul again. His words sank into her, heavy as iron but warm as the firelight, and for the first time, she realized how much her presence had changed him. The giant cowboy who once lived only for silence now carried her pain as his own. The confrontation came at dawn. The men returned, louder, drunker, emboldened by numbers. 5 riders this time, their laughter sharp as knives. They rode hard toward the ranch, calling Clara's name, threatening to burn Cain's land to the ground. Elias stepped into the yard, shotgun cradled with terrifying ease. His voice roared across the plain, "You'll not cross this fence alive." Clara stood behind him, her hair whipping in the wind, her heart hammering, yet she refused to hide. If the West was going to test her again, it would see her standing tall, not cowering. The standoff crackled, like lightning in dry brush. Fingers twitched near holsters, horses snorted, restless, and then, silence broke into chaos. A shot rang out, echoing like thunder. Elias's gun barked in answer, the blast throwing one rider clean from his saddle. The others panicked, firing wild, but Cain moved like the mountains themselves, unshaken, unstoppable. His voice thundered with every shot, "She is not your cattle. She is not your coin. She is free." When the dust settled, 2 men lay wounded, the rest scattering into the horizon like wolves chased from fire. Elias stood tall, his chest heaving, his hat lost in the dirt. Clara ran to him, fear and relief colliding in her heart. He lowered the rifle, his massive hand trembling slightly as she pressed herself against him. For the first time, the giant cowboy let his guard fall, burying his face in her hair as though her presence was the only thing tethering him to earth. The town heard of it by noon. Some cursed Elias for bringing blood to his land. Others whispered with awe of how one man had faced down half a gang to defend a woman who, by their cruel standards, had no value. Clara walked through the mercantile days later with her head high, her hand steady on Elias's arm. Where once they saw a broken girl, now they saw a woman claimed not by chains, but by her own defiance, and the unyielding loyalty of a man who would rather die than see her caged again. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars scatter like silver dust, Clara finally spoke the truth she had buried deep. "When you bought me, I thought it was another kind of prison. But you gave me back my name, my dignity, my life." Elias said nothing for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the endless prairie. Then, quietly, he answered, "I didn't buy you, Clara. I bought the right to make sure no one else ever could." Tears brimmed in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of something long denied, hope. She reached for his hand, her fingers trembling as they laced with his. In that quiet moment, the vast loneliness that had once haunted Elias Cain and the unbearable pain that had once chained Clara melted into something new. Not ownership, not rescue, but partnership, the beginning of a love born in fire and forged in defiance. The West would remember Elias Cain as the giant cowboy who stood against the cruelty of men. But Clara would remember him differently, not as a savior, not as a legend, but as the man who gave her back the strength to smile, to breathe, and to dream again. And on that wide, unforgiving prairie, her smile became the light that fed his starving heart.